welcome to this podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest today is Alice Hérait, who has a piece in this month's paper entitled Taiwan's Divided Loyalties. Before we get to the interview, just a quick reminder that all previous episodes of this podcast are on the website at mondediplo.com, and you can subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss another episode. Alice is a Taipei-based journalist whose attention this month has been focused on Taiwan's elections, which were won for an unprecedented third consecutive time by the pro-sovereignty Democratic Progressive Party, DPP. In May, Lai Ching-te will take over as president from his DPP colleague, Tsai Ing-wen. Placing second in the vote was the candidate from the Chinese Nationalist Party, KMT, which takes a more conciliatory attitude to China. This, unsurprisingly, is the major dividing line in Taiwanese politics, and looking at its historical roots is a theme of Alice's article in the paper. As China continues to claim sovereignty over Taiwan, the election result has done nothing to ease tensions between Beijing and Taipei. A Chinese spokesperson said soon after the result, "Taiwan is China's Taiwan," echoing President Xi's claim on 31st December that Taiwan's unification with China was a historical inevitability. When we spoke last week, I began by asking Alice if, with the DPP remaining in power, anything significant had changed in Taiwan.
The first thing that changed is the pretty interesting thing to notice is that for the first time, the DPP or any kind of party in Taiwan has won a third consecutive presidential elections. And this election has been pretty marked by a third candidate that is called Ko Wen-je. And this is not the first time that a third candidate is making a big score, but this is the first time there's someone who decided that he won't be either blue or green. By blue, I mean people who are advocating ideally for reunification with China, unification with China, while the green side would stand for independence. But we see that so Lai received just over 40% of the vote, which is not as good as Taiwan did back in 2016. And his principal opponent, Ho Yo-yi, had 33.49% of the votes, while Ko Wen-je, the third candidate, who was not any part of any stance toward China. He had a stance that was not, at least that changed a little bit from the KMT and the DPP division. Did 26 for 45% and had a lot of young people's vote. And we can say also that out of the 19 million voters of Taiwan, 14 million showed up. So it's like 72% of the voters, which is like pretty a big score. Last 2020 was 74%. And also this year, we're likely to face a highly divided parliament. So the KMT won 52 seats, the DPP 51, while the TPP, the Taiwan People's Party, the party of Ko Wen-je, which is pretty a new party, wants 8 seats. And we can notice the absence of independents, like die-hard independent party, like New Power Party or the Taiwan State Building Party, who won no seats. I think there's many reasons. The Taiwan State Building Party might be seen as a very radical, quiet, Taiwanese ethno-nationalist party. They're also pretty young, so maybe it doesn't inspire confidence among voters. And the New Power Party, a lot of the main figures joined the DPP, which means also that, to my mind, I don't know if I'm right, but it means that also that very, very pro-independence people are joining the DPP, which the DPP means that the DPP is like more comfortable with showing its will for independence. So facing this highly divided parliament, I think Lai Ching-te, William Lai, might have troubles to pass some bills. We can think about military spending. We can think about the numerous challenges that Taiwan is facing, like we have elderly care, energy policy, and of course, policy toward China. But I'm an optimistic person, and as an optimistic person, I would say that having a divided parliament will force the legislators to find common ground. And it could lead to a positive outcome, a better understanding between factions. And I think this is very important in Taiwan. And then relating to the piece I wrote for Le Monde Diplomatique, I think this is a big issue in Taiwan, that actually people don't really talk to each other. They don't share their views, how they see the past and how they see the nation. So they might be very vocal in politics, but among families, among friends, my point of view as an observer and as someone who has Taiwanese friends, this is like, I realize that most people who have the same belief, they just tend to stand together, and the people who don't agree with each other don't tend to debate. They don't tend to argue, because conflict is also something culturally that is hard to accept, which this is quite different from France, right? Because in France, we love like debating, we love arguing, we love having fights, and sharing our political views. Why in Taiwan, it's less well seen culturally.
So you have to, as a journalist, I guess, be able to read between the lines. That if there are things which people are not saying aloud, you have to kind of know what they're saying behind their actual words. There are things which go unspoken, but nonetheless are significant to them.
Yes, this is true. But I think what I noticed, I went to rallies. I went to the KMT rallies. I went to the DPP rallies. I went to the TPP rallies. And all of them, like, all those people, I'm sure my candidate is going to be elected, because like you live in a cycle, and then you tend to get close to people who think like you, and then you imagine that everybody thinks like you.
And then the result can be a surprise. We can all think of examples of that in Western electoral recent history. So yes, it's not a uniquely Taiwanese phenomenon.
It's not a uniquely Taiwanese phenomenon. Yeah, I might repeat myself, but in Taiwan, there's also a tendency to avoid conflict and to not talk about political stance, at least not to talk about how you see China and how you perceive Chinese culture.
So we in the West tend to see Taiwanese politics mainly through the lens of the relationship to China. I mean, I guess for obvious geopolitical reasons. But I wondered, you've been going to rallies, you've been talking to people, you've got Taiwanese friends, you're very much in tune with what's happening in Taiwanese society. What were some of the things which were motivating people's vote? It was about more than simply the relationship with China. Clearly that's important, but what were the things that people felt strongly about that played into this election?
Yeah, so there's often complaints in Taiwan about the fact that the debate is only related to the relationship with China, and then that the questions of the domestic questions that relate only to Taiwan are seen as secondary. And so there's a lot of complaints of people being like, okay, you've been talking about your view from China, because the main divide between DPP and KMT is that each of them follow an ideal. So almost all Taiwanese are for maintaining the status quo, because they don't want war and they don't want to be unified with China, at least the People's Republic of China. So the main divide in Taiwanese politics, Green side wants to follow the ideal of independence while maintaining the status quo, while the KMT wants to think about unification in a very, very far future while maintaining the status quo. But there's also many issues that we might think about. There's a lot of livelihood issues that has taken a little bit of space, like in these elections. We can perceive a kind of malaise among young people. The housing is unaffordable. They have very low pay. They work tremendous hours. There's a problem with migrants, for example. There's a need for elderly care. There's a need because it's an aging population. It's a population that doesn't have children. The birth rate is really, really low. And these are problems that actually worries the Taiwanese people. And that's also a reason why the Ko Wen-je has made a good score is also because he was focusing on these issues, and he was trying to get out of the two main party divide, and to focus on corruption, focus on the problem of housing, the problem of the rent, the low salaries, to give young people more power. But we can't deny that the China question is still predominant. And I think during the local elections that happens every 4 years too, but the last one was in 2022. The last local elections, they would focus more on local issues, because they would be electing mayors, they would be electing local councillors. And this election usually doesn't attract a lot of attention from the Western media. But this is also a moment where people can vote for the person they might think would be better to lead their city, or to be a good counselor for the city, and not to care too much about the China issue. But for the presidential elections, we can say that I do believe that most people ultimately vote for the one who they think will stand against China or will maintain Taiwan's sovereignty. Because both parties, the KMT and the DPP, are willing to have pledged to protect the sovereignty of Taiwan. But the KMT believes that through dialogue with China, we're going to avoid war, while the DPP believes that by making friends with the West and standing against China, we will avoid war. And people are pretty concerned because there's a new foreign policy piece, and they've made a very good survey. And we see that 60% of people in Taiwan are concerned by an invasion by China. And 60% are not confident that the US will defend Taiwan. So there's a major concern. They have a question like, how concerned are you about China starting a war with Taiwan? And there's only 10%, almost 11%, that are not at all concerned. So it means that the other part of the population is at least slightly concerned about a war with China. I mean, there's a noticeable difference between the party affiliations. Like, people who affiliate with the DPP, they might be less concerned about a war with China. So yeah, so there's a difference within party affiliation. The KMT people, the people who vote for the KMT, tend to be more concerned about provoking China. They're more concerned about the possibility of a war, and they're also less convinced of United States reliability.
So, Alice, you will have been watching international reactions to the election. Clearly, the two key countries are China and the United States. I wondered what you made of the way they have reacted. There are certain, diplomatic moves that, there's certain encoded language, or they say perhaps things in ways that have to be interpreted quite subtly. And I wondered what you made of the way they had both reacted to the election result.
Well, it's not that subtle because, I mean, yeah, there's of course subtle reaction, but there's also not subtle reactions.
Warplanes, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So what I'm saying is that basically Lai Ching-te has been elected, and the first thing and then as Beijing see the DPP as a separatist party, that this is how they frame it. The first thing we were expecting was a reaction from China. But I mean, China was way more moderated than we could have think. Because okay, we had a launch air and sea patrol, but it has been relatively quiet. It has been nothing compared to Pelosi's visit back in 2022. So Thursday morning, we see that the Ministry of Defense in Taiwan reported 24 planes, 5 Navy vessels in the Taiwan Strait, and I think 5 of them passed the air defense identification zone of Taiwan. And it's the most significant number since November. We can also mention that the state of Nauru changes, switch its recognition from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China. And this is the 10th ally to flip side in 8 years since Taiwan of the DPP has been elected in 2016. But overall, I'm going to go back to it later, but I think that the main reaction of China is to come. And I think will be when William Lai is going to be inaugurated.
And that's in May.
Yes, that's in May. And on the U.S. side, there was a statement, congratulations from Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, who congratulates William Lai for his victory. The U.S. is sending many delegations to Taiwan right now. They are not officials. They are like mostly retired or like politicians. I mean, former politicians in office. So this is not an official visit that would be likely to anger China. But still, there's a lot of delegations from the U.S. coming to Taiwan right now. We notice also a few, for example, the president of Philippines. I mean, there's a number of presidents from many countries that congratulated the new president of Taiwan, and the Chinese embassy responding, saying that this is not a thing, that being angry, releasing communiques. It happened in France. I mean, we have a very, very vocal ambassador in France. The ambassador of China is one of the Wolf Warrior, and he's famous for his shock declarations toward Taiwan.
I was saying before we began recording today that what I really liked about your piece in this month's edition of Le Monde Diplomatique was that you found a really interesting way to open up the history, because the history of Taiwan is so important to understanding its present and its future. You decided to open the piece by focusing on a statue, and we know how much emotion and feeling can be bound up in statues all over the world. And you chose to focus on the statue of Chiang Kai-shek in central Taipei, in very grand memorial building and museum. And I wondered if you could say something about the statue and the man it represents, and also why it's so important to sort of understand him and the statue's symbolic significance in Taiwan's present.
Yeah, so to give a little bit of context, the statue of Chiang Kai-shek this memorial is in the center of Taipei, just right next to the presidential building, right next to all the official administrative buildings. So it's right in the center of politics in Taiwan. And so we have this big memorial that is huge, and with the big statue of Chiang Kai-shek guarded by soldiers 24 hours, and with a big police presence just to protect the statue. I was not planning to talk about this, but it comes to my mind right now that a few years ago there was this policy for transitional justice where the Taiwanese government pledged to erase the symbols of the authoritarian past. So what they did is that they took out many Chiang Kai-shek statues, because we had this Chiang Kai-shek statues in every school, in every official buildings. So they took them out, and they put all of them in a park in New Taipei City. It's very close to Taipei, but it's pretty remote still. So it's really hard to access. It's not some place you access by metro. But there's this big part where you see all the Chiang Kai-shek statues that are not far from his tomb. And people go to visit them. It's very interesting. And it was also when William Lai, the new president, was a mayor of Tainan, the city in the south, which is very DPP, very green leaning. And so in Tainan, you can never barely see a statue of Chiang Kai-shek anywhere. But still, the biggest statue hasn't been removed, and the transitional justice process is supposed to be over. At least the committee is over. And so a lot of people are just protesting because they want to dismantle the statues. But I think there's a big issue because the statues doesn't only symbolize the authoritarian past, because Chiang Kai-shek is not only a dictator. I think the statues symbolize also the complexity of today's Republic of China, which is still Taiwan's official name. And for many, and mostly the older generation, and that's what I talk about in my article, is that the Chiang Kai-shek statues represents the victory over the Japanese during the World War II. During World War II, it represents the fight against communism during Civil War, and it represents also Chiang Kai-shek represents also someone who decided to maintain the Republic of China, at least in some territories of what we call China at the time. So Taiwan, Jinmen, Matsu, and Penghu. So for the record, Jinmen and Matsu always been part of China. I mean, always, at least since very ancient times. And so these territory are what is Republic of China right now. And a lot of people would argue if there was no Chiang Kai-shek, there wouldn't be Taiwan right now. Taiwan wouldn't be what it is right now. Nevertheless, the Republic of China, in its beginning, wanted also to bring democracy toward all China, but unfortunately, this is not what Chiang Kai-shek brought in Taiwan. He brought an authoritarian regime, and he also is remembered as a dictator, as the initiator of the martial law, where a lot of people were imprisoned for no reason, or for being considered as a communist or standing for Taiwan independence. And we can say that maybe this is his son, Zhang Jingguo, who start leading the country toward democracy. A lot of people wouldn't agree, but it's also a problem of narrative. Yeah, so that's mostly what the statue will symbolize. It will symbolize very, very different interpretation, and it depends on what you focus. But it's the most controversial statue in Taiwan.
And as you were saying earlier about people perhaps being reticent about expressing their political opinions openly, you found that people were guarded in what they were willing to say to you on the record about their reaction to Chiang Kai-shek's statue and him as a figure, for precisely that reason of not wanting to come out and say something too divisive or too critical or nail their political colours to the mast. So some people you spoke to gave you their opinion, but they did it anonymously.
Especially employees of the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial, employees of this park where all the Chiang Kai-shek statues, most of them are admire or at least have a nuanced view on Chiang Kai-shek, but they don't want to say it out loud. Because also the big museums in Taiwan, so the Palace Museum or like the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial, the director is appointed by the government. So it means that since 2016, the director of Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall is probably leaning toward the green side. I mean, she didn't tell me this, but this is like, she didn't want it to talk. She didn't want it to talk. So like nobody, like I asked a lot of employees, I asked a lot of people who have decision maker toward this memorial, and they don't want to raise controversy. They don't want to say anything different. But the thing is that the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial changed. Like I was a student in Taiwan back in 2013, and I went to Chiang Kai-shek Memorial, and it was all about how Chiang Kai-shek was great. And now it's more about the object he used to have. Like we can see his car, we can see his old costumes, we can see things he wrote. but we can't see like they're not really praising him. And now they're talking more about the limitation of freedom of speech. They're talking more about which is good, but still nobody is satisfied. And I interviewed this KMT supporter who used to be a volunteer who accepted to talk to me on record, and then he said like, well, I think there's many places to criticize Chiang Kai-shek, and I don't think a memorial is the place to criticize Chiang Kai-shek.
And you describe the exhibition as actually physically shrinking. So it's, you know, that's a very clear indication about an evolution in how Taiwan is thinking about him. And it's also an indication that Taiwan is evolving and how it's thinking about its own history. He's kind of like a symbol of that history, and this is a manifestation of it. So can you say something about this sort of wider historical questions? You know, I didn't know very much about the Japanese occupation, for example, of Taiwan. I knew it had happened, but I didn't know, you know, its place in the sort of psyche of modern Taiwan. So there's clearly an evolution going on in the democracy period. So can you say what some of the big questions or the big changes that are occurring are?
So basically, during martial law, the government controlled the narrative. So there was a narrative. They wanted to shape people's mind into retaking the mainland. So there was this narrative that Taiwan has always been part of China. We're all Chinese, and we're gonna retake the mainland. And so, as opposed to it, Japanese, everything that was Japanese are defined as local Taiwanese culture were dismissed, were not always suppressed, but as it considered like not very intellectual, considered like folk cultures. They were considered like folk minority cultures. They were not considered as the elite culture. So since Taiwan democratization, and also before the Taiwan democratization, with all the Taiwan independence dissidents, there was a counter narrative. And the counter narrative explains that Taiwan has never been part of China. And today, this is the most popular narrative. But if you think that Taiwan is part of China, you don't go to prison for that. But among young people, among young academics, I think you might be kind of rejected. Like you might be, it might not be easy. And the truth is that, I mean, the thing that I find is sad, but I think we have the same problem in any country, is like the polarization. And there's this narrative, there's this counter narrative, and both of them are factually sometimes not true. Saying that Taiwan is not part of China, has never been part of China, is factually not true. Like in 1945 to 1949, it was part of the Republic of China. The Qing dynasty controlled most of Taiwan territories. And also some would argue that the Qing dynasty didn't control the entire territory. But all the question is like to define what do you consider as control, what do you consider being a state, what do you consider as being a trans country. Some will argue, as I heard the Taiwanese ambassador and the Taiwanese representative in France, that the Qing dynasty were not really Han, but do you consider a country only by the ethnicity of people who govern? So I don't think that in the academic cycle, I don't think among historians, these arguments are really, it's what I'm saying is like, it's more an activist argument than it is a scientific argument. And the second question we can think about is like, if you want Taiwanese independence, does it really matter that Taiwan has never been part of China, like, or that Taiwan has been part of China? The question is like, what do you want in the future? What do you want? Is the past that important? But it seems that people who argue for independence or people who argue for unification struggle to define that, use historical arguments to prove their point. And sometimes I think this is dismissive for them, because I think they should look at you should look at the future and not look at what is in the past.
Because it's so ambiguous, as you say, there is not a clear scientific answer. You cannot settle a question in a binary way. however polarized the politics, by saying, well, it is either part of China or is not part of China, is clearly much more complicated than that. And I wondered, therefore, you talked about the birth rate being low, but nonetheless, I wondered what the younger generations think about this question, because often demographics, push politics in one direction or another as a new generation with different views grows up and comes to political maturity. And I wondered, if we look at young Taiwanese, what kind of indicators are there about what their stance will be towards, or what their stance is, but as they become more demographically significant, what their stance will be towards this key question of the relationship with China?
Well, I think culturally, the young Taiwanese tend to identify as Taiwanese. They don't tend to identify as Chinese anymore. And there's really few people in Taiwan, and I think the majority will be in the islands next to China, like Jinmen and Matsu. There's really few Taiwanese who identify themselves as Chinese. And more people, and especially the young people, identify themselves as Taiwanese. And even among the Kuomintang, a lot of people identify as Taiwanese. They will use Taiwanese language more and more. They will localize their party more and more. If you want to work on the data, if you want to see the data, the National Zhengshe University is always every year posting surveys on who do you identify, and what do you want for your future? Do you want a status quo? Do you want independence? And then we see that along the years, more people tend to identify with independence, with Taiwan, more than they identify with China. And this is something that China tries to counter, because, like, for example, they were recently after the election, I forgot which Chinese official said that they will have to use TikTok, that will have to use social media to encourage the young people to feel more Chinese. So it's not irreversible. I don't think it's irreversible, but I think the Taiwanese narrative is way more convincing for the young people.
So TikTok is part of the answer. You said, Alice, earlier on that you felt the Chinese reaction was yet to come, and I'm sure that's true. And I wondered if we could end today on this question, because you've been describing a kind of status quo which is unresolved but has kind of held for quite a long time. But we know that China at least expresses its dissatisfaction with the status quo. So on the 31st of December, Xi, in his address, spoke about unification with China being a historical inevitability. So it's clearly something that he puts high on the agenda. He talks about it a lot. It keeps coming up. It's part of his sort of political identity in China. So I wondered how I'm not asking you to predict the future, because that's clearly impossible. But when you said you think China's reaction is yet to come, what kind of things were you thinking about? What kind of things are you looking for? What kind of things will you pay attention to in the months ahead? You said, the inauguration in May is clearly a significant moment. So how are you thinking about the next 6-12 months in this difficult relationship?
Well, it's hard to imagine that the tension will not continue, because Lai Ching-te has been elected president, and he's the successor of Tsai Ing-wen. So the tensions are likely to continue to Lai administration, and I think they will. And I think that Lai is certainly not gonna give China what they want, because what they want is they're gonna ask Lai to recognize the 92 consensus, and then for the record, 92 consensus it's a consensus that has been held by Chinese and Taiwanese officials in 1992, where they decided that they agree on the one China policy, and that each side would choose their interpretation of what is one China. But for the DPP, the 92 consensus equals one country, two system, which equals reunification with China. So as far as we have a DPP president, they will not accept this 92 consensus. So the tension is going to be rising. The official connections with China will cease. And so I think that it is very possible that Lai will face increased pressure from China and will struggle to balance the deepening relations of the DPP government with Washington, while also not allowing China to justify any change of the status quo. If we see when we read the Global Times, which is the Chinese official media in English, they would often emphasize that how Lai is a very unpredictable person, standing for independence, that he's moody. He might, and then they might likely try to provoke him. They might likely try to make him say something or act something, so they could give an excuse to China to attack Taiwan or to increase the pressure. So I think in May I will probably look closely at the reaction of China. I think this is a tense moment.
I was speaking to Alice Hérait, whose article in this month's paper is entitled Taiwan's Divided Loyalties. You can read Alice's article at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can also read every edition of the paper going back over 25 years and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of open access content online to entice you to become one. You'll find all previous episodes of this podcast on Le Monde Diplomatic's website, and you can also subscribe on your favourite podcast app to make sure you don't miss future ones. In the words of John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world behind the misinformation. I'll be back again next month with another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Thank you.